Welcome back to Sidewalk, Skyline podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Rogers, and this is a podcast where we explore God at work in Canadian cities. And so the city on this episode is Winnipeg, and I have special guest, John Longhurst. John is a long-standing contributor, religious columnist to the Winnipeg Free Press, to Faith Today, Religion News Service US, and other venues of writing I'm sure we'll hear about. So welcome, John. Great to have you on the show today.
Thank you.
Yeah, listen, I read in your bio that you were born in Southern Ontario. You spent your early years here. And whereabouts in Southern Ontario did you live?
I grew up in St. Catharines, Ontario, which is a place many people had never heard of before. When they view me quizzically, I say it's between Toronto and Niagara Falls, and then everybody knows where it is.
I know St. Catharines well. Tell me about those early years, childhood and youth, growing up in Southern Ontario.
Well, I'm sort of a typical person in that respect. No matter where you grow up, I think people think it must be better somewhere else, and you just can't wait to get old enough to go away, and I did. I moved to Winnipeg. I thought it would just be for a year, but here I am 40 plus years later. I grew up in an evangelical church environment, or as I like to say, a severe evangelical church environment. I grew up in a Christianity that promoted a very severe, angry, mean, and judgmental God to me. One that was just as likely to slap you upside the head for stepping out of line as he was to give you a hug. And so I've spent the rest of my adult life, teenage and then adult life, trying to rediscover the kind of faith and the kind of God parent that isn't like that. Right. We all deal with different traumas from our backgrounds, and I don't blame my parents, and I don't blame the pastors, and I don't blame the church. That's just the way it was back then. But it has left me with some severe deficits in terms of understanding what faith can and should be. And I've spent a lot of my time just thinking about how I can understand a God who has a much wider mercy than one I was raised with.
Yeah, I think a lot of people our age grew up in a more legalistic day, when there was much more of a harshness in some places. And that definitely starts you on a journey.
It does.
Yeah.
And later in my life, I came across we all know the hymn, "There's a Wideness in God's Mercy." But there's a verse in that hymn that is that we never sang when I was growing up, and that I almost never heard sung. And it's near the end, because this hymn has, I don't know, a dozen verses. And it goes, let me just pull it up for you here. I'll tell you right away what it says, since I wrote it up for myself. "But we make God's love too narrow by false limits of our own. And we magnify God's strictness with a zeal that God will not own." And that has been a verse of that hymn that I've thought, yeah, that's right. That's right. We've elevated and amplified things that promoted a strict view of faith, when in fact what so many people are just craving for is acceptance and love and welcome, and coming to a place where they just feel that I can be there and I can be myself, and nobody puts the proverbial "yes, you're welcome" but behind it. Come on in. And I think that's probably something that the world needs more and more of these days.
Yeah. So instead of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, you decided in your life, it sounds, to say, no, I will seek, and I will find God as He is. And I mean, how else could you devote so much of your life to writing about religion?
Exactly, but writing about religion makes it sound so sterile. I write about religious people. The story of religion is the story of people. story of the Bible is the story of people. It's a people story. It's the story of people trying to figure out, what is this thing called faith? Who is this God? What is my relationship to that God? And in my work as a communicator, and now with the Free Press on the Faith Beat, I have this enormous privilege to enter into people's lives and ask them exactly that question. How does your faith motivate you to do whatever the thing is I'm writing about at that time? And that is what excites me, because that's where faith is found. God bless everyone who goes to meetings and works on theological statements and doctrinal things and all of that. But I would much rather talk to someone who's working at a food bank and ask them, so why do you do it? What makes you want to be here? Why do you give your time? I find that that's where the real rubber hits the road when it comes to faith. And I really love having the opportunity to tell those stories.
I think some of what you're saying is modeled in the life of Jesus, isn't it? He did have times when he spoke, truth to religious leaders and engaged at a very deep level with them, and often the case was to point to what was missing. They had the exterior, they had the tradition, but they lacked the heart. And Jesus spent so much time among the common folk and the folk that got overlooked, and that's probably where he was best received.
And from a journalistic point of view, that's something that I tell to my friends who are bishops and pastors and denominational leaders and all those kinds of things, that in the main, I am not interested in your meetings. I'm not interested in the annual get-togethers where you debate all of these important topics. What I want to know at the end of the day is, I want to talk to you, and I want to talk to the people in your church or your faith group and say, what does that mean to you? How will that change your life? How will it affect you? How will it be worked out in practice? That's where journalism shines, and that's what I'm interested in. So you won't see a lot of my writing about the big, huge, hairy theological statements and doctrines and creeds, but you will find me asking people, so how does that impact your life? How does it change the way you view the world?
Yeah. Something I don't tell a lot of people, but in the 80s, I studied broadcasting. And at that time, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I just knew that whatever I did, it had to synchronize with who I was as a person of faith. And I had no interest in pursuing Christian television per se. I was more interested in music and the arts and things like that. And somehow, God's leading, I ended up becoming a pastor. But I never forgot the lessons I learned about journalism in those early days. Things I learned about how broadcasting has an effect on people, but what amazes me is that all these years into the age of internet and moving into AI and just the how much things have changed in media, and what really begs the question is, how is it possible that you are still gainfully employed writing a religious column in a national newspaper, the Winnipeg Free Press? Why did all the other pages go away, and how are you still standing?
Well, that's a good question. There can be a school of thought about religion in the medium. First of all, let me just say that the Winnipeg Free Press is the only major Canadian daily newspaper left in the country that still has a faith page and a faith beat. Everyone else has let it go. That was not the case 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Every Canadian daily newspaper had a faith page, and many of them had faith reporters. It was just considered that important. But the reason that you don't find it anywhere else today is not because the media hates religion. That's not the case at all. If anything, they probably see it as irrelevant. They don't have a strong opinion about it, just something that a few people do on Sundays or on weekends. The main reason why the faith pages and the faith beat has disappeared is just simple economics. The media is really, really hurting financially these days. One of the first things they did is get rid of what they called the soft beats, and that would be food, fashion, travel, movies, book reviews, games, and religion. They just couldn't afford to keep those things going anymore, and so they let them go. There was no concerted effort, no conspiracy to get rid of faith. It was just that they couldn't afford it. In my case, at the Free Press, it's really because it was my own initiative. In 2018, the then publisher and the current editor announced that they wanted to do a better job of engaging the communities in Winnipeg. And I went to them and said, well, if that's the case, one of the communities you're not engaging or serving very well is the faith community. And they said we would do it if they had more money. And I said, what if I go out and raise that money? And that's the project that I have created at the Free Press called Religion in the News. I raise between $20,000 and $30,000 a year to pay for journalism, my journalism, and I used to have a colleague who worked with me as well on a freelance basis. And this money comes from faith groups in the city, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, Baha'i, Christians of all stripes, and individuals who give every year through a crowdfunder. And that enables me to do articles, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 or 4 articles a week about faith in the newspaper. My stuff appears all through the newspaper in almost every section, and I write a column on Saturdays on the faith page.
You wrote a new book, and it's entitled, Can Robots Love God and Be Saved? And you had me at the word robot. It's actually a selection of from over 900 columns that you've written for the paper. And as I was doing a little bit of reading and seeing how you write, and I thought, well, yeah, if this was in the paper, I think I'd probably be reading it on a regular basis, whether I agree or not, just for the fact that you write interesting stuff, and you ask some intriguing questions. You challenge assumptions. So, I just got to ask the question, can robots love God and be saved, John?
Well, I would like to answer tongue in cheek. Well, you'll have to buy the book to find out, won't you? But the answer is, I don't know. And I don't mean to be facetious in saying that. My goodness, machine learning and AI is advancing so quickly today, and we don't know where it's going to end up. It's impacting so many sectors of society, and it's impacting religion as well. So, for example, in Japan, you can get a robot priest to say the end-of-life prayers for a deceased family member at a fraction of the cost of using a real human priest. Are those real prayers, or aren't they? Who knows right now? Then you've got, if you have an iPhone, you have Siri on your phone. Could you ask her to pray for you? And if Siri did, would God hear it? I don't know. Well, what about sermons? So I did a column once where I asked ChatGPT to write me a sermon about the Good Samaritan with implications for today when it comes to addressing issues like poverty. And you know what? It did a great job. And some of my clergy friends even acknowledged that. So is that, again, a place where we think about robots and getting saved? Mm-hmm. And then what if one day machines can learn to think and make moral decisions? Self-driving cars. If there were 3 people in front of a car when it was going out of control, or 1 person, would it be able to decide between 3 and 1? Would that be evidence of sentience, or is it just algorithms? I don't know. All of these questions are out there right now, and it seems to me that these are the kinds of things we should start thinking about at this time. It's just not possible to know right now, but maybe in 20 or 30 years, some theologians in the future are going to have to make those kinds of decisions. And let me just add one more thing while I'm at it. There are people working on pills for morality right now. And so, would you take a pill if it could increase your levels of kindness or honesty, the kinds of things we consider fruits of the Spirit? People are working on that stuff. It's a brave new world out there, and there are many things to think about. And right now, I don't find that a lot of people of faith, Christians as well, are asking those kinds of questions. And I, in my columns, want to ask those kinds of questions. Just put them out there and make people think, I wonder. That's my point. That's my purpose.
Yeah, it seems that at least so far, artificial intelligence relies on language models and being able to evaluate patterns in language. And then, of course, we've all had Google now for quite a while, and so it accesses what you ask it to access and compiles, and it is intriguing to see, and I think we're living in a very intriguing time, and you're right. Somebody needs to be asking these kinds of questions. Glad you are, John.
Well, I'm just doing my own research and coming across people who are much smarter than me, who are asking these questions and writing about them. And through my columns, I simply want to put them out there and say, here's something to think about. Maybe you hadn't thought about this before, but your kids or grandkids, or maybe even you yourself, are going to have to deal with this one day.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting exercise, and I'm really glad that I get the chance to do it.
Mm-hmm. Talk to me a bit about the role of faith in journalism. What kind of as I surveyed the kinds of things that you're writing about in terms of faith, you have that curiosity of like you mentioned earlier, going to the people and finding out the lived experience more so than somebody who has a carefully controlled corporate expression, let's say, of what faith is. So what place do you see for faith journalism in the public sphere?
Well, it's already there. As you know, as your listeners probably know, attendance at worship services of all kinds is decreasing rapidly. More and more people are calling themselves nuns, N-O-N-E-S. They have no affiliation. Along with the nuns, there's another category of people that you may have heard of as well, called the duns. These would be people who are older in the main, who have just said, if I'm asked to be on another church committee, I'm going to scratch my eyeballs out. I'm just done, done with the institutional church and running an institutional church. And so lots of people are falling away from organized religion these days. But that doesn't mean spirituality has gone away, even though large numbers of Canadians indicate they have no affiliation with any kind of organized religious group. They also say they believe in God or a higher power. Many say that they pray, and some indicate that they engage in some sort of private spiritual practice that could range from prayer or Ignatian examine, of taking time to review their day and in a prayerful way, or just walking in the woods or something. They are aware of something bigger, something mysterious, something mystical. So that still exists out there. But in the main, if you are in most any community except for Winnipeg, you're not going to bump into it in your media for the most part.
Yeah.
You're not going to come across people saying, well, I organized this thing, whatever it is, because I am, and then name the religious group that you're a part of. It's my way of showing love and kindness because I am whatever. You're just not going to do that. There's I have an acquaintance who used to work at a television station in the United States in the 1980s, and she was well known for always finding the religion angle, what's called the religion angle, when she went out to interview someone. And her news director said to her, her name was Peggy, she said, "Peggy, how come whenever I send you out, you come back with God?" And she replied, "How come you keep missing him?" You will always, if you're looking for it, you will frequently, not always, frequently find some kind of spiritual, religious dimension to the story. But you have to be looking for it. You know the singer-songwriter Steve Bell. Steve's a friend of mine. Steve has been complimented for his unique and wonderful songwriting abilities, and he certainly is a songwriter. But he will often demur and say, no, the songs are out there. I just have my antenna up. And so I run into them. And similarly, myself as a religion journalist, I have my antenna up. I'm looking for it. And it's not hard to find. In fact, I have more stories than I can possibly use simply because they're out there everywhere. And they just need to be told. That said, it's hard for the media today to tell them simply because they're so cash-strapped. I would also add at this point that there is a very good religious or Christian media network, lots of church publications, but they're just as stressed financially and in many other ways. Faith Today, Christian Courier, Broadview, Catholic Register, I can name a number of them that are telling these stories. But just like the Toronto Star and the National Post and the Globe and Mail and everybody else, they're struggling to make ends meet. It's a hard time to be in journalism these days.
Book sales, are they overall down as well, or have people stopped reading in traditional forms and spending more time reading things online or just listening online?
Oh, that's a bigger question. I don't have a good enough handle on that. I do know that book sales did decrease rapidly for a period of time. They seem to have bottomed out a little bit or stabilized, but many people read online. I do. I use a tablet for my reading. I borrow books from the library that way. I also listen to them. But yes, you're right. The way we get information has changed a lot. If you're under the age of 45, you probably don't read a newspaper. You may have heard this before, Kevin, that the number one reason why people stop subscribing to a newspaper is death. They die. That's how it's, because the majority of newspaper subscribers are what? Older, right?
Right.
Or grandma has dementia and she can't read the newspaper anymore. And so we do have, we're in the midst of a huge change. When the printing press was invented back in the 16th century or 15th or whatever it was, it took about 100 years for the changes of that revolution to work their way through the system, for all those people who were scribes and handwriting out books to lose their jobs and for it to transition to this new thing. Well, we've made that transition in 10 or 20 years. It's been brilliant at lightning speed, and we still don't know where it's all going to fall out. But it is certainly moving online, no question about it. I would hazard a guess that 10 years from now, there'll be very few newspapers, if any, in print. It just won't make economic sense. There are three main costs to publishing a newspaper. One is the journalism, second is the printing, third is the delivery. And if you can eliminate the printing and the delivery, maybe you can make the journalism go. And that's where everyone is now struggling. But we live in such a noisy environment. Google is great. By the way, because I'm old, you can see that. I made my first website in 1994. And when I made my first website, there were less than 3,000 websites in the world.
Wow.
Now today, what are we at? A billion? 4 billion? 5? I have no idea.
More websites than people, probably.
Right. And then you have social media, which came into being in 2006, right? And now it's just a normal part of our lives. Um, we live in a noisy, frantic environment, and how can you capture attention today? That's the challenge for everyone who writes anything. It's a challenge for you. That's a challenge for anyone who wants to communicate with the public. Is how do we break through the clutter, break through the noise, and capture the attention of a few people to say, hey, I've got something important to share with you. You need to know this. And if you have the answer to that, well, they'll pave the way to your door.
I'll write a book that nobody will buy.
There you go.
Hey, I think when we think about our religious climate in Canada, with the nuns and the duns and all of those major shifts, do you think that for a large part, people have lost their sense of mystery and enchantment?
Oh, that's a good question. You know what's fascinating, and maybe you've seen this, there's a lot of younger people who are heading off towards the Orthodox churches.
I've seen
and
that,
the Anglican churches. There's a joke in Winnipeg that the fastest growing Mennonite church is St. Margaret's Anglican Church. There's lots of people who grew up in the sort of sparse evangelical traditions. No art, no paintings, no statuary, no anything that looked like that. Hungry for that kind of religious expression that is more visual, more artistic, more creedal, even, that the ancient prayers, the ancient traditions. I'm sensing not a lot, I'm sensing people moving in that direction, that there's a sense that there is something mysterious out there, and the traditional way religion is being presented to them by many churches and denominations just isn't touching the part of them that needs to be touched, and not laying the blame at anyone's feet, just saying that there are people just looking for something that's different, that acknowledges the mystery that surrounds them.
Do you think in your work that you have a role of being an enchanter? Are you somebody that is, do you have any sense that part of your job is to arouse curiosity?
Oh, to arouse curiosity, sure. I'm a linear thinker. I think many journalists are. I'm not. I can't write fiction to save my life. I wouldn't be able to develop a character of any kind. So that's not me.
But you know a lot of characters.
I do know characters, but I think yes. But even just through my articles, I'm working on an article right now about an international aid group that is trying to get some food aid into Gaza. Well, it's a church-related food group, food organization. And my last question to the executive director is, what's motivating you? Well, because Jesus said, feed people. That's what Christians do. It's, there's a lot of reasons to do it, but at the base for him is that. And so I want to include that when I tell the story. This organization is doing it for a number of different reasons. But one of them is because they're taking Jesus's command seriously. And I want to make sure that is included in my reporting.
I think I read in some of your biographical stuff that you grew up Mennonite, and the MCC, the Mennonite Central Committee, have been real champions of the way of Jesus and the way of peace among the dispossessed peoples of the world. And so without knowing the content of your article, I'm wondering, is it an MCC group that's going into Gaza?
Yes, partly. It's through Canadian Food Grains Bank, which is a church-related organization of which MCC is a member, and they're one of the groups trying to get food aid into Gaza. Yes, absolutely. And MCC MCC and Canadian Baptist Ministries and
Hmm.
Nazarene Ministries and all the others that belong to Food Grains Bank. They are in my mind, among the best representations of what it means to be a Christian today,
Hmm.
because they are there wherever there is hurt and need, bringing that cup of cold water and that food to people who need it. No questions asked, right?
Yeah.
And I think, wow, good for them, good for all the work they do, and for everyone who supports them.
I love that. I love that about the MCC. And little known fact: the Pentecostals, of which I'm part, uh, before the World Wars in the early part of the 1900s, um, Pentecostals were actually in their some of their early documents. They were pacifists, and it mysteriously disappeared from our constitutional documents around the time of the World Wars, and I don't know if there's any record of a general conference voting to take that out or how it all happened.
Hmm.
But I've long admired the Mennonites for that position of pacifism, and anyway, it's just a little side note there, and we have so much to learn from all of the different movements that have happened with God's people, and to take a exclusive, narrow view that well, our group has, we've got all that in a bag of chips. Well,
Mm-hmm.
it usually leads us to darker places when we don't have that sense of connection to uh, the larger people of God,
Mm-hmm.
and what our shared mission is. Um, so uh, one of the things that I've been a part of for several years is being one of the representatives on the Canadian Multi-Faith Council, formerly known as the Ontario or Canadian Multi-Faith Federation, formerly known as the Ontario Multi-Faith Council. And that's a diverse body of religious sorts, and TAOC has long had a spot at the table, and those kinds of collaborations really were formed and forged to give the interface in the public sphere for religious concerns, spiritual and religious care in institutions, being able to work together on common causes. And I haven't been active in that group for a couple of years now, and but you write a lot about interfaith and about what there is to learn from somebody who has a completely different view of God, or maybe not even God, but just a philosophy that is different from yours. And talk to me a little bit about that in your work, how how you roll in the interfaith realm.
Well, sure. Well, the first thing to note is that I'm the faith reporter or the religion reporter. I'm not the Christian reporter.
Right.
So it's about faith in its biggest and most general way. But that also includes humanists and atheists, who I also like to interview, because that is an aspect of faith. It might be anti-faith, but it is within the spectrum of faith. The one thing you're most apt to hear, and you probably heard this 100 times, Kevin, when you did your work with the Interfaith Council, is that when people get together, you often find out, boy, we have more in common than we thought. Sure, there are different ways of viewing God or theology that are different, but at the basis, we just have a lot in common. And one of the things that every great religion has in common is what Christians call the golden rule, which is do unto others what you would have them do unto you. It's different in different religions, but by gosh, everyone has some version of it and understands that treating other people well, being kind, don't be a jerk, those kinds of things are just sort of woven right into their religious understanding. And that then can play itself out in so many different ways as we seek to use the idea from the Old Testament, when we seek the benefit of our city, or we seek the health of our communities, right? Pray for the place where I've sent you into exile, that kind of idea, that it will be good with them because then it will be good for you. Right. And I would extend that also when I talk to my Christian friends who might sometimes feel otherwise about other religions, and I'll just remind them that in a secular society doesn't mean no religion. It means everyone has the same playing field to be on. And if you want to have freedom to follow and your religion and to worship the way you want to worship, then we also need to extend that to everyone else. We all benefit if we all can enjoy that same freedom. Because if you start taking the freedom away from one group or freedom away from another, how long is it before they come after you and say, well, why should you be allowed to do that if the others can't be allowed to do that? So my role is to talk about all religions and to say, here's how they all roll. And isn't that interesting? And as people read about them, hopefully they'll say, wow, they're moms and dads just like me. They are grandparents. They go to work. They complain about taxes. The grocery prices are too high. How am I going to put the gas in my car? Just like I do. In other words, we're all human and we all bear God's image and we all have the same hopes and dreams and fears. And we need to be neighbors and we need to help each other navigate this crazy thing called life somehow.
I love your example of the Israelites in Babylon, in exile. And God says, okay, settle in here. You make sure that people are cared for, that your city prospers. You be a good citizen here. Mm-hmm. And if everybody around you does well, then you'll do well. Mm-hmm. It's bearing that responsibility. And people like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they couldn't bow to another belief system, but they could sure serve their neighbors. Mm-hmm. They could sure make the country a great place and do a really good job of serving. Mm-hmm. Serving that government, which was the one that had oppressed them and taken them into captivity.
Mm-hmm. And look, let me add real quick that especially for older people, 50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, Canada was a completely different place. We really could call ourselves a Christian nation.
Yeah.
And Canada today is completely different. And so I understand how unnerving and how it can feel to some people to think like, wow, all those things that we once took for granted have gone away. Part of me says, yay, I'm glad that happened because we're talking about the end of Christendom, which I think most of us are saying was probably a good thing to have happen, to take away all the state supports for a particular religious view or particular way of doing religion. But we do live in a multi-faith and multicultural environment. And isn't that amazing? It's a different world. For some, it's unnerving, but it's also a really special place for all of us to be right now.
It's probably more like the early church world than a lot of church history has looked like, mm-hmm. where Christians have not had an edge. They've had to love God with all their heart and love their neighbor as theirself, mm-hmm. and just walk with Jesus and figure it out together. Mm-hmm. Part of the story that's in a lot of people's I would say cultural consciousness is the failures of religion. Mm-hmm. and they certainly get a lot of airtime. If it bleeds, it leads,
Mhm.
and yet there's some horrible things that have happened in the name of God, in the name of Allah, in the name of Buddha. You can't find a perfectly clean religion that doesn't have some bad examples, some bad actors that are very harmful to others.
Mhm.
And so when you're writing about religion, with that kind of backdrop, um, is that something that you're always mindful of in your writing? Are you trying to tell a counter story? Uh, Sometimes you have to tell that story that says, yeah, you know what, this public figure in religion, they blew up. Their life is a mess. They hurt a lot of people. But then there's all these other stories that don't get the headlines, right?
Mhm.
So talk about that sort of journey of journalism and how you approach it.
My approach is one of balance. So when it comes to bad stories will always get told. They don't need any help. They've got a momentum all their own.
Mhm.
So if there's a sex scandal somewhere, or if the treasurer runs away with the church money, or someone blows themselves up in a marketplace in the name of their deity, that's always going to make the news. It's
Yeah.
just normal. What's not going to make the news is that indigenous Christian grandmother down in the north end of Winnipeg who's doing something for all the kids in her neighborhood and
Yeah.
making sure they have cookies and milk every Friday. Nobody's going to tell that story
Yeah.
unless they go out and look for it. Good news needs a push. It needs somebody paying attention. It needs somebody going out and looking for it. The bad news will wash over you all the time.
Yeah.
And so through my work, I'm trying to find the balance. So I have many Muslim friends. And if you're a Muslim in this country since 2001, since 9/11, the
Yes.
story has been the angry Muslim shouting death to the USA or whatever,
Right.
right? I
Right.
mean, and so the medias can be filled with that. So I don't need to add to it. I don't have to go out looking for those stories. It's all over already. But what's not found as much is what? Oh, look, the Muslim Islamic Association, Manitoba Islamic Association, here is running a food drive for the food
Mhm.
bank. Well,
Yeah.
who's going to tell that story? I'm
Yeah.
going to tell that
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to say, yes, that bad stuff happens. I'm never going to deny it. But on the other hand, here's some other stuff to help you balance that picture out so that you don't end up thinking that people from that religion, and by that, I just don't mean Muslims, it can be evangelicals. If there's one group of people in this country that most Canadians, well, a survey was done a few years ago. Who are the people that you don't like the most, or respect the least, or fear the most in this country? Muslims were up there, and evangelicals were number two. So, and it's not because Canadian evangelicals are doing anything wrong. It's because the news comes this way from the United States all the time. Um, but anyone, I want to tell the stories saying it's just not what you see on social media often or other places, that there are other elements to the story. You need to weigh them both. And so, yes, the Catholic Church did a terrible job with the residential schools, but yes, look what they're doing with Indigenous people right now. Look how they're trying to make up for it and make amends and make a difference.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of things I'm trying to do.
So you do have a unique role of being a good news journalist.
I do tell the bad news too,
Yeah.
and everyone who supports the project knows that's going to happen.
Yep.
Um, and so in 2022, I was very privileged to go to Rome to be there with the indigenous people when they went to meet the Pope and ask him
Hmm.
to apologize. And then I was able to go to Alberta and hear his apology. And
Hmm.
I was able to meet a lot of indigenous people and tell, my goodness, just the most terrible stories of what those people experienced as children. in
Hmm.
church-run schools. It's horrible. It's awful.
Yeah.
Um, but those stories needed to be told too. And God bless the bishops here in Winnipeg. They wanted those stories told. Nobody was trying not to tell those stories or telling me not to tell those stories,
Hmm.
but they need to be told too. And I was privileged to be able to be that voice for those Indigenous people to hear their stories. So those stories have to be told as well. Yes, absolutely. And
Yeah.
I do tell them.
Um, I got one more question that I
Mhm.
want to ask you about, and I mean, it's probably more personal, and that has to
Mhm.
do with an article I read in your book,
Mhm.
praying for God to take Dad home.
Mhm.
And a lot of people have, if their parents are still alive, they may be facing just the degeneration that takes place physically and mentally. Aging parents, some moving into long-term care, and you wrote about your father and how your father had this lament in his final years. You know, your mother had passed on before him, and it was kind of, if I can paraphrase, your dad just saying, you know, why am I still here? I just
Mhm.
want to go home, you know. And so he'd actually pray. I think you
Mhm.
said that God would take him home in his sleep, and
Mhm.
then, oh boy, I'm awake again, new
Mhm.
day. Talk to me about what you witnessed in your dad and how, and I would say, you know, just kind of, I want you to temporarily, you know, be a preacher here and talk to us about how we need to grow in our care for the elderly.
Sure. I would first add that my dad is not unique. I hear that from a lot of older people. I have a 95-year-old aunt, and when I leave her, she always says, remember, pray that I can go home in my sleep. Remember,
Mm.
pray for me. Pray that I can
Yeah.
go home. She's ready to go, for heaven's sakes. And that's what she asks us to pray for.
Mm.
Um, First thing I've learned about getting older, and I'm not old, but I feel older, is getting old is not for the faint of heart to begin with.
Yeah.
Um, it's not something you think about in your teens and 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, but by gosh, you do when you're in your 60s. And so that's number one. It's a hard time, and we need to pay attention to that. Secondly, and I have written about this. When we think of a dying church, if I was to say to someone, "What do you think a dying church is?" The number one image that would come to most people's minds is an aging church. It's got a lot of old people, no young people, no young families. That's a dying church. Well, you know what? The fastest growing demographic in Canada today is people over 65, us boomers, right? Canada is filled with older people, and so are churches. And the church, as far as I can tell from the writing I've done, is woefully unprepared to minister to those people. Almost, I've been on seminary websites. I did it just within the last couple months. I looked through Canadian seminary curriculums, desperately looking for any courses on ministry to seniors. And it's 10 to 1 young people and families versus seniors. There's almost nothing that any seminary will prepare you for dealing with seniors. You know, that's probably going to be the number one demographic any clergy person is going to be dealing with in the future is figuring out how to work with people through those life transitions of retirement, bereavement, health issues, all of those kinds of things. And yet, the church is just not there. Um, there's a new term that's being used a lot, and maybe you've heard it before, Kevin, called elder orphans. There's an epidemic of elder orphans in this country and in the United States as well. These are people who have children, but their children have moved away. They live in Winnipeg, but their kids are in Calgary, Vancouver, and Fredericton. Or they're single, or they're widowed, their partner is gone, and they have no one around them. No one to call to say, hey, can you get the leaves out of my eavesdrops, or can you shovel my snow, or whatever. there's these. This is the new call, I think, to the Canadian, not just churches, maybe all faith groups, to be paying attention to this now. God bless what happened to my parents. They got into a great personal care home. I was here in Winnipeg. They were in Ontario, so it comes back to me. They were a bit elder orphan with me as well, even though I made many trips to go and see them and stayed in touch and looked after their finances and things like that. But that's the situation or the plight many older people find themselves in today. And I don't sense that Christians or that churches in this country are really stepping up to the plate on that one at this time. So that's a good sermon, isn't it?
I think so. I think if you were to give an altar call right now, I would raise my hand and say, yeah, that's speaking to my heart.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my parents are in their 80s. My wife's parents are in their 80s. We're blessed that they still live in their homes, but we're watching the struggles that they go through and thinking about the future. And I think you're right. I think that, you know, if people of faith can find ways to provide just a stronger sense of connection and belonging and community and advocacy, because boy, it's hard when you go to the hospital unless you are really articulate and can, you know, talk through what's ailing you, unless it's you know, well, your fingers cut off. That's kind of obvious, but those internal health issues, you know, we need people that can accompany the vulnerable in their medical care.
Right, what some congregations are doing, not enough, but a few, but something called parish nursing. Have you heard of that?
Yes, in fact, we're looking at relaunching that here. Yeah.
That is a marvelous thing, and that's where someone who's retired from healthcare as a nurse or a doctor, or sometimes they're employed, but often they're volunteers 1 or 2 days a week to go visit shut-ins, elderly, the vulnerable, just to see how they're doing. One pastor and parish nurse that I interviewed, you know, the pastor, the clergy person said, I can go visit an elderly person and I can have a wonderful conversation with them and all sorts of things, but I won't notice that their hand is shaking. It won't occur to me. Or when they get out of the chair to get me more tea, just how hard it is for them to get up. But a parish nurse will notice those things and say, Mrs. Jones, something wrong? Well, my knee's been giving me some trouble. Have you had that checked out? No, I don't know. You know, I'm a little worried. I don't know how to get through to my doctor. How about I call your doctor and make an appointment for you? And that is the way it works. Parish nurses don't diagnose, they don't treat, but they advocate and they do that kind of thing. They also check the cupboards in the fridge. What are these people eating? Oh man, there's not enough good, healthy food in here. It's all snacks or something. In other words, they're paying attention to their physical needs, not just the other needs. And they're just stopping by once a month or once a week just to say hello, right? Just to say hello.
Thank you so much, John. And if I lived in Winnipeg, I think I would probably subscribe to the Free Press just to see what you're saying.
Well, and here's where it's just lucky for you. You can go online and you can read them all for free. Everything I write on the faith page is outside the paywall because it's paid for. So anyone can read it. Just go to Winnipeg Free Press and look for the faith button.
All right. Send me a link and I'll include that in the show notes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Blessings, my new friend.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode with John Longhurst. As often is the case, guests for this podcast come out of somebody saying to me, oh, you should talk to or it comes out of people that I meet in my limited journeys across the country. And if you have somebody that you think would be a great guest on this podcast, we're really looking at people who are exposing God at work in Canadian cities. And if you know somebody where in the city where you live, by all means, send me an email, kevin.rogers@paoc.org. kevin.rogers@paoc.org, and say, hey, here's contact information, here's a little bit of details about this person. You may want to consider having them on as a guest. And I don't think I'm going to run out of interesting people to talk to anytime soon. In fact, our next episode, we're going over to Calgary to talk with Connie Jacob. Connie has been a guest on a panel that we did on season 2 of Sidewalk, Skyline podcast. And she's recently engaged in being a church planter in the Ogden neighborhood of Calgary, a neighborhood that she grew up in. And it's quite a fascinating story, and Connie is definitely a fascinating woman of faith. And so join us again, will you? Until that time, I'm your host, Kevin Rogers. You're listening to Sidewalk Skyline Podcast.